before being convicted of assault and torture of his wife, was simply to see his dog one last time. But as the animal quickly walked towards him, something unbelievable happened. That moment changed everything forever. The silence in the courtroom was oppressive, heavy as a dark cloud covering the midday sky in Texas. Present in the courtroom was Michael Carter with slumped shoulders and deep eyes, sitting in the middle of the room, his hands shaking slightly on his lap. His appearance showed exhaustion and resignation, but there was something more in his eyes. A desperate plea, almost inaudible. He just wanted one last thing, to let me see Rocky, the dog that had accompanied me throughout the dangerous journey of fighting in Afghanistan. He begged the judge, and against all expectations, the request was granted. The wooden door opened, and all eyes turned to the strong figure of a German shepherd being led by an officer. Rocky ran in as if this was the last time he would see his master. His alert ears and deep eyes scanned the room until he found Michael. As soon as he saw him, the dog jerked on the leash, letting out a short howl, tearing the silence apart like a sharp blade. Michael buried his face in tears, his previously restrained expression melting into anguish. "Oh my God," someone in the audience whispered, unable to contain his emotions as he witnessed the reunion. Rocky threw himself at Michael as soon as the dog was released, and the man knelt down to hug the dog as if its life depended on it. "I am so sorry, my friend," he whispered, his voice trembling, and the barely audible tears fell without stopping. As his hand ran through Rocky's thick fur, as if he was trying to engrave that moment into his soul, knowing that it would be the last, Michael's eyes filled with pain, turned towards the judge as if begging for something more. A change, a miracle, anything. But then something unexpected happened. Michael was stroking his hand under the fur of Rocky's neck and saw a small mark under the skin. But if it wasn't Michael, who had been attached to Rocky since childhood, he wouldn't have been able to detect it. Then Michael looked horrified and couldn't believe what he was feeling. It seemed like he was touching a screw that was embedded in Rocky's neck. The defense attorney sitting a few feet away witnessed everything, including Michael's worried expression and his wife Layla's frightened face. As he approached his pale face, he suddenly took out a piece of paper and wrote some words on it and hurriedly handed the paper to the judge. "Your Honor, we need to suspend the trial immediately." The courtroom fell into chaos. Everyone didn't know what was written on the paper, including Michael. His eyes flashed with hope, but it was quickly swallowed by fear, because in his experience, hope always came with pain. Judge Avery, an older woman with silver hair pinned into a tight chignon, peered over her spectacles and regarded Michael and Rocky with a mixture of concern and calculated skepticism. She had seen countless cases in her tenure: manipulative defendants, tearful confessions, well-intentioned but misguided claims. Nothing was new. Yet something about the wounds on Rocky and the raw vulnerability in Michael's face compelled her to exercise caution. "These new findings may not immediately exonerate Mr. Carter," she cautioned. "However, in the interest of justice, I will allow the defense additional time to investigate. Court is adjourned until we determine how Rocky's injuries might intersect with the broader allegations." A chorus of whispers and exclamations flooded the room. Reporters hastened to gather quotes, lawyers shuffled papers, and the judge struck her gavel to command order. Shortly thereafter, bailiffs wheeled Michael away, returning him to custody under special measures, a guard posted at his cell door around the clock. Although the adjournment offered a spark of hope, Michael's heart pounded with dread. He understood nothing was decided yet. He was still, in the eyes of the law, an accused man. Outside the courthouse, the storm clouds of suspicion refused to clear. Back in the holding area, Harold visited Michael, pressing him for every detail that might connect Rocky's wounds to the overarching allegations of spousal abuse. Was Rocky ever injured in combat? the lawyer asked, flipping through pages of Michael's military records. Michael shook his head, a scowl crossing his face. Never. That dog was the best. We went through some tough assignments in Afghanistan, but Rocky always came out unscathed. If he got injured, I'd have known. Harold nodded, adding this crucial piece of information to his growing list of puzzle pieces. Both men were thinking the same thing. If Rocky had always been healthy, how did he end up with fresh scars after living at the Carter estate? Harold secretly followed Rocky when a sympathetic bailiff agreed to release the dog temporarily into Harold's care. Together, they traveled the long country road to the Carter estate, a sprawling property that had once been a slice of pastoral paradise. Now it stood as a haunting reminder of all that had gone wrong in Michael's life. The fields were overgrown, and the silhouette of the main mansion loomed in the distance, flanked by tall, ancient trees. As Harold parked the car, he noticed a young man stepping onto the front porch. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with a casual air that suggested labor and physical strength. Harold recalled Michael's fleeting mention of someone named John Everett, a hired worker, a lumberjack or handyman of sorts, who had been employed around the estate to manage tree cutting and repairs. Harold decided to keep a low profile. He watched as Rocky recognized the man, but displayed none of the excitement he had shown toward Michael. In fact, Rocky stiffened. The dog's ears went back, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. It was the first sign that something was deeply amiss. Harold quietly followed them around the side of the house, carefully peeking in through open windows. And that was when he saw her, Carol Carter, Michael's wife. She appeared in the living room, talking quite intimately with the young lumberjack. Their body language was undeniably close. At one point, Carol reached out to brush a strand of hair from John Everett's forehead, and the two exchanged a meaningful glance that bordered on the romantic. Harold snapped several photos discreetly, heart-pounding. This was precisely the kind of evidence that might reveal a hidden motive behind the accusations. With photographs in hand, Harold took Rocky back to the car, mind whirling with possibility. The strange, raw wounds on Rocky's neck, the suspicious closeness of Carol and John, and the questionable nature of Michael's charges painted a dire picture. By the time Harold returned to the city, he had decided on his next steps: gather more evidence, speak to anyone on the estate who might offer insight, and dig into Carol Carter's background. A gnawing realization had begun to crystallize. Carol might have set Michael up, and John Everett was likely involved in whatever plan she was orchestrating. It made sense. If Carol and John were lovers, then framing Michael for abuse would be an ideal way to get rid of him while claiming his estate. The next day, while Michael sat in his cell fuming with anxiety, a mysterious woman arrived at the jail to see him. She wore dark sunglasses and a plain beige coat that obscured much of her figure. The guards initially refused her entry, but she insisted she had urgent information for Michael Carter. Once granted access, she approached the wheelchair-bound soldier with caution. "I can't reveal my name," she whispered, her voice wavering. "But I work as a clerk in the county records office. I've seen documents. Your wife and that young man, John Everett, have hatched a plan to seize control of your estate, the farmland, everything. You're just a pawn in a far bigger scheme." Michael's eyes narrowed. That suspicion had lingered at the back of his mind, but hearing it confirmed triggered a tidal wave of anger and heartbreak. "They're forging papers, inventing statements," the woman continued. "I have enough evidence to get you started, but you must move carefully. They're cunning." Then, with a furtive glance at the guard, she handed him a small folded note and fled. Meanwhile, Harold, who had been surveilling the estate alongside Rocky, discovered that Carol and John often disappeared into a small wooden cabin located at the far edge of the property. The overgrown trail leading there was lined with thorny bushes and overshadowed by towering sycamore trees. A hidden spot, perfect for secret rendezvous. Without entering the cabin, and thus risking trespass, Harold snapped photos of the two going inside, sometimes staying for hours. If Carol was truly involved in framing Michael, these clandestine meetings could be the key to unraveling the entire malicious plot. In his cell, Michael's mind drifted back to how it all started. He recalled returning from Afghanistan months before he was scheduled, forced into early retirement due to a severe spinal injury. Carol's reception had been lukewarm. She claimed it was simply the shock of seeing him in a wheelchair. But as time passed, her excuses grew more frequent and more suspicious. Each afternoon, she had reasons to leave the estate, visiting neighbors, running errands, or attending local charity events, only to return late into the evening. He had chalked it up to restlessness at first, but as her absences mounted, so did his suspicions that something was amiss. Now, with the revelations swirling around him, everything felt like it fit a chilling puzzle. As worry gnawed at him, Michael feared for Rocky's safety. If Carol and John Everett were indeed behind the injuries on Rocky's neck, the dog remained at risk as long as they had unrestricted access to him. Even though Rocky was now traveling with Harold, returning to the estate for further investigation meant real danger. "You have to contact an animal protection group," Michael begged Harold during one of their meetings. "Promise me Rocky will be safe. I can't lose him." Harold nodded solemnly. "I'll make sure no one lays a finger on him. I swear." The following evening, a maid from the Carter estate made a secret visit to the jail. She was a timid woman named Clara, with a long history of service in the Carter household. She found Michael's cell and whispered through the bars, "Mr. Carter, I've served your family since you were a boy. I never believed you'd harm Mrs. Carter." Her hand trembled as she passed him a folded letter. Inside, Michael found incriminating details, notes discussing a plan to frame him for domestic violence, references to bribed witnesses, and mention of forging legal documents to secure the entire estate in Carol's name. Tears stung Michael's eyes as he read each word, but he forced himself to remain calm. Clara's loyalty would be crucial. "Thank you," Michael whispered, stifling his fury. "Keep yourself safe, Clara. They'll stop at nothing." Emboldened by Clara's letter, Harold escalated the investigation. He interviewed local farmhands, neighbors, and the staff who had worked at the estate for decades. He discovered that Carol had been intimately involved with John Everett, even before Michael's abrupt return from war. More damning evidence emerged. Suspicious financial records indicating large withdrawals from Michael's accounts, all orchestrated by Carol. It became abundantly clear that she had carefully planned to accuse Michael of abuse, assuming that his disability and the stigma of post-traumatic stress from his military service would make him an easy target. John Everett's role seemed to be one of an accomplice and potential future co-owner of the estate, once Michael was out of the picture. When the case resumed at the courthouse, Harold presented everything: the photos of Carol and John, Clara's letter, the testimonies of farmhands who overheard suspicious conversations, and perhaps most importantly, Rocky's injuries. A veterinary expert took the stand, testifying that the scars on Rocky's neck were consistent with deliberate restraint or possibly even torture, certainly not the sort of injury one would expect from an animal living with a loving family. The expert confirmed that Rocky had never been marked like that in his records from the military. The revelation rocked the courtroom. Gasps erupted as it became evident that the dog had likely been mistreated to coax a false narrative of violence within the household, one that Carol had pinned on Michael for her own financial gain. The prosecution visibly struggled to regroup, their once confident posture unraveling. Judge Avery's voice hardened as she addressed the room. The evidence suggests a conspiracy involving Mrs. Carol Carter and Mr. John Everett to fabricate claims of domestic abuse. This court cannot, in good conscience, proceed with charges against Mr. Michael Carter without further investigation into these new allegations, This time, the hush in the courtroom gave way to murmurs of approval from spectators and even some of the prosecution's own aides, who had begun to question the credibility of Carol's allegations. Moments later, the judge formally dismissed the charges against Michael, her gavel echoing off the paneled walls. "Mr. Carter," she pronounced, "you are hereby cleared of all allegations concerning the abuse of Mrs. Carter. The court shall open a new investigation into Mrs. Carol Carter and Mr. John Everett under suspicion of conspiracy, fraud, and perjury. Furthermore, Rocky's role in revealing the truth of this case shall be duly noted in the records. Let it be known that justice often finds its voice in the most unexpected ways." Cheers and applause filled the room, accompanied by the furious shrieks of Carol, who had been sequestered in a corner of the gallery. Her eyes glared with venomous rage, and John Everett, flanking her side, looked equally furious. Bailiffs quickly moved in, ordering Carol and John to remain for questioning. With the crack of the judge's gavel, the trial that had once threatened to ruin Michael's life was finally over. Released from his unjust captivity, Michael rolled his wheelchair out of the courtroom, Rocky faithfully by his side. The sun was high overhead, bathing the courthouse steps in a radiant glow, a fitting contrast to the darkness and deceit that had finally been exposed. Harold, exhausted but triumphant, patted Michael's shoulder. "You're free, Carter," he said, smiling. "Let's get you home and start putting the pieces back together." Tears of relief and gratitude slipped down Michael's cheeks. He paused, glancing down at Rocky, who gave a small wag of his tail in return. As reporters swarmed them, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward, Michael realized something fundamental. He was still fighting a war, but not the kind of war waged on foreign soil. This was a battle to reclaim his life, his dignity, and to safeguard those he loved. For the first time since he had been accused, he felt the stirring of hope. He had survived an onslaught of lies, manipulations, and betrayals, and emerged with the truth on his side. Now the path ahead would be about healing from the scars, both his own and Rocky's. Michael Carter would never forget the moment Rocky pulled on his leash in the courtroom, nor the tears that fell when he discovered the hidden scars on his beloved companion. That heartbreak had become the catalyst for uncovering a far larger conspiracy aimed at his ruin. But Rocky's presence also reminded Michael of the true meaning of loyalty, a virtue that Carol and John had so callously ignored. Now, free from the burden of false accusations, Michael's mission had become clear: to protect Rocky and honor the bond forged in Afghanistan. They moved forward, side by side, veteran and dog, ready to rebuild a life shaped by truth and devotion. And as the sun set on the Carter estate, Michael offered a silent oath to the loyal friend at his feet that, whatever the next battle might be, they would face it together,